All right, hello and welcome back for round two of the Alicante Open. As I mentioned in the previous video, I'm going to be doing this sort of immediate reaction, unfiltered, unedited stream of consciousness, sort of deep analysis recap for every round of not just this event, but pretty much every tournament that I'm going to be playing in 2025. In addition to that, once I get back to the States and have the opportunity to look back at the tournament as a whole, not just in the heat of the moment, I'll also be producing a much more digestible, episodic, narrative focused sort of overview of the tournament as a whole. So if you're interested in that and just sort of seeing the results without getting super into the weeds of like every individual decision of every individual position, go ahead and subscribe. That'll be back probably in about 2 or 3 weeks from now. But the videos that'll come out over the next week or two will be this style of just going over the game. So let's get into round two. We After the sort of disaster, not quite disaster, but mini disaster that we had in round one, unfortunately drawing a very young, very talented, very capable of beating strong players, like a 12-year-old Spanish 2000 that we were unable to win even with the white pieces. We were punished appropriately by getting paired against a second 2000 rated 12-year-old Spanish 2000. This time, of course, we have the black pieces. This is a very unpleasant pairing. It's sort of by far the nightmare scenario for any tournament, playing a young, like, super underrated player with black, for a number of reasons. I mean, one, obviously, there's a lot of risk. If you lose the game, if you draw the game, you're putting a lot of rating on the line, as well as the tournament as a whole. Like, if we draw, God forbid, even lose this game, it's like super over. If round one already puts us down in the dirt, we have to crawl our way back up. So this is very much like a must-win game. But it also really changes how you think about the opening, and we'll see that very quickly. My opponent started with d4, which I expected. I talked last episode. It's not always easy to trust a database for these younger players. They can very easily change their opening repertoire in just a couple of months. So I wasn't 100% sure what to expect, but most of my opponent's games were in d4, so I certainly wasn't surprised to see that. But I was surprised to see knight c3, which I don't think he has a whole lot of games in. I was expecting knight to f3, which is a much more sort of solid choice, inviting a number of transpositions, possibly back to knight c3, possibly into the Catalan. Just a little bit more of a flexible choice, and by far the most popular one, not just for my opponent, but more broadly in chess for the last several years now. So knight c3 does allow the Nimzo Indian, which I'm generally quite happy to see on the board against a lower rated player, because there are very few ways to just kill the game against it. If you do want to kill the game, like if you're playing white against an Nimzo Indian and you want to kill the game, you can definitely do it. I'm not gonna say there are no ways, but you do have to know a little bit in order to accomplish that. It's not quite like a scenario where in some Catalan type positions where you can play pretty much anything, and it's very difficult to lose the game. The Nimzo, you definitely can just lose the game if you don't go for the most concrete options. So I was happy that it was allowed, but e3 is by far the most solid response to Nimzo Indian as a whole. It's also one of the most challenging from a theoretical perspective, even if my opponent were trying to win the game, which maybe he was. I don't know. Generally, I assume that they're probably pretty happy with the draw. And so already we have our first choice of what to play. And this is where I think the calculation is very different in a normal game versus a must-win game against a much lower rated player. Normally in this position against e3, historically I've played the move b6, which is not the main line and not the most sound, but it's fine. It's not really refuted. You just reach a perfectly fine position. One of the main lines continues, for example, knight e2, trying to defend the knight on c3 so that you don't have to recapture with the pawn and ruin the pawn structure. Bishop a6, this is a point of b6, is to put pressure on c4. White generally forces the issue with a3, which forces black to take. And then after black plays d5, white has a choice of a couple of moves here. b3 is one, taking on d5 is one, queen f3 is one. But they all lead to a very complex sort of strategic battle with chances for both sides. So this is what I would normally do. The problem is that these positions are There's chances for both sides if white's trying to win. If white's not really trying to win and doesn't, I guess a better way of putting it is like the premise of this whole opening, or this variation of this opening, is that if white wants to achieve anything, they have to take some risks. They have to play like f3 to prepare e4, which introduces a weakness. They have to expand rapidly on the queen side, which introduces some holes in the position, like on c4. They have to maybe allow black to capture on c4, for example, after b3 takes, and introduce this weakness that can drop off. Black has lots of ideas to deal with this, and they're not all entirely sound. Again, from a theoretical perspective, I think white is supposed to have quite a pleasant objective advantage here in these most of these sorts of lines, but black is not without fighting chances. Like we do have the ability to punch back. But if white doesn't do any of that, if white is very content to just trade the pieces off and sit, black doesn't really have many active ideas of his own. And so when you're playing like a much lower rated player, and again you need to win, and you don't expect them to go for something aggressive or ambitious themselves, not the greatest sort of situation to be in. So instead of b6, I decided to go for the main line, which is castles. And in hindsight, I think this was a really bad decision. I think I kind of mind game myself too much. I probably should have just played b6, stuck to what I know. Yes, it's not really clear how black is going to ever make something happen, but realistically, from a practical perspective, your opponent probably is going to do one of those ideas just because they don't want to sit there and do nothing forever. And there's always going to be like some opportunity. Whereas in castles, like this is the main line because it's very, very solid, but it also leads to a lot of liquidations in the main lines. So my opponent played bishop d3. This was also possible after b6 for sure, but part of the point of rushing with b6 is that white doesn't get time to get the ideal setup with knight e2 in castles. For example, if we played b6 here, knight e2, bishop b7, if we were uncastled and this was a move faster, then white wouldn't have time to just castle, but here he does. So b6 is still a possible move here for sure. It's nothing, not like, completely terrible, I think. But white, like once we've castled, we've sort of already committed to not going for that system directly. So d5 is by far the main move. a3 was played, and here I was vaguely aware. I don't know a lot of theory here because, again, I typically don't play castles. But I was vaguely aware that there are several options for black. Taking on c3 is by far the most natural, of course, but dropping back to e7 is not that bad either. It just leads to a different type of position. I think this is mostly a matter of taste. And so in this game, I decided to take on c3, which, again, in hindsight, I think was a mistake. I was expecting a sort of different, maybe like you can even call this a miscalculation. Like I was expecting that after b6 and knight e2, something like bishop a6, we'd reach a very, very similar position to the Rubinsteins that we were talking about, except that white has been forced to take back with a pawn instead of taking back with a knight, as they would be in, for example, this position. Here, after something like d5, yes, they do have to, take with the king, which is unpleasant, but the knight is much better placed here than in the main position where the pawn, like this position where the knight is now sort of offside on e2, and the c3 pawn is a bit of a target. The problem here is that white, I think, again, I haven't looked at all of this with an engine, but I think the problem is that white can liquidate this immediately with c4. This was the move that I was struggling with very, very heavily in the game, and I don't think black has any real way to deal with this. I don't think black's much worse here or anything, to be clear, but white's position is extremely solid. This bishop that we're trying to play against, like this is the whole point of black's opening is to sort of restrict this bishop. It's just getting out here completely, and there's not really any reason that black can ever even aspire to an advantage. Like it's very, very difficult to contrive a scenario where black is better. You can very easily contrive scenarios where black is equalized, but it's very, very hard to imagine black being better. So in this position, I actually spent like about 15 minutes, which is a little bit insane for this early stage of the game and probably just poor time management. But I really couldn't find a way to deal with the fact that white is just going to take and play c4 against like any move, assuming white is happy to make a draw, which again I assume my opponent probably was. And so after a very, very long think, I decided that I probably had to risk it with c5. This is a very loose-looking move, not a move I was very happy to play, but it does at least interfere a little bit with taking in c4. I thought, for example, if takes c4, which is still possible, then I mean, I hadn't really come up with like something like super concrete, but many of the options in the center at least lead to something. Like even like takes, knight takes, like maybe a knight gets to c5. There is technically an imbalance in the position with pawns on different flanks. White has a 4-on-3 majority on the king side. We have a 2-on-1 on the queen side. We will get a very, very powerful knight to c5. Our bishop is very well placed. Both knights can come to e4. White is probably just better here, and it's probably not close. I would expect that this is actually like a very, very substantial advantage for white. We can check with the computer shortly, but it's probably going to be up there. But I didn't think that this was like completely terrible. So that was generally the idea of c5, was that at least we'll be able to, you know, completely liquidate the center. If we had played, for example, the line that we were talking about with bishop d3 takes and then c4, if we, for example, take, now the center is not completely liquidated. White is probably actually like borderline winning here. I wouldn't take on c4, but just to illustrate the point, like we would like to play c5 and take on d4 here if we were allowed, so why not get that out of the way? So that's why I played c5. I'm not sure it really makes a whole lot of sense. There are other lines that we need to calculate here as well. For example, takes, and then c4 anyway, which with a very similar idea of just getting a lot of pieces off the board. I think this would have been also perfectly reasonable for white. The main point here that I sort of overlooked for a while, at some point I decided like, okay, I just have to do this anyway. One of the main points is that d4 is not possible because of this very typical tactical trick white has by taking on d4. And now we can't take back with the queen because of this very, very typical discovered attack pattern. We actually saw this same pattern in round one, where we were sacrificing the queen to an idea like this in a way that maybe worked, maybe didn't. I still am not entirely sure. But it does mean that here is no ambiguity. It definitely doesn't work, so we can't play d4. We would have to play something like bishop b7, take on c4 maybe. I don't know, maybe like queen a5 check, knight c6, like just some kind of developing move when white again probably just has a significant advantage. So I was very happy to see my opponent play take and then not follow up with c4, which I was concerned would lead to a position that like was playable for sure, but very, very difficult to win from, and instead played castles, which I think is probably objectively going to be the best move by like probably a good margin. I mean, it's by far the most natural move. You pretty much always want a castle, but it does give me the opportunity to fix the structure a little bit, not allow so many liquidations, keep a few more pieces on the board. But some pieces we don't want to keep on the board are these light square bishops. White's is considerably better than ours. Our light square bishop is, it's not like the weakest piece in the world, pawn structure wise, but with the pawn stuck on d5 forever, it will never be able to move forward. It's almost never going to be able to take, because again, if white was going to play c4, he would have done it already. So this bishop doesn't have a lot of scope, very, very little future. And with white's pawn chain almost entirely on dark squares, this bishop is very, very bad. This is the thing that we're going to be playing against for the entirety of the game. But the light square bishop is a beautiful, beautiful piece. And so this train of logic should lead us to what probably is the only reasonable move in the position, which is to trade off the light square bishops. Now, white technically can avoid this exchange by sliding all the way back, but now this bishop on a6 is not really poorly placed anymore. It does have some scope, so we would be pretty happy to just complete our development with something like knight c6, start targeting these weak squares like c4, b3. Again, this bishop is suddenly doing a very, very important job in corralling this very, very important outpost for the knight. White will never be able to play c4. And this bishop does have like some role It does have a lot of scope along this diagonal, but it's not enough to justify the contortions that white has had to go through for the rest of the position. Again, the whole name of the game, this entire opening, is centered around whether white can activate the dark square bishop, and a move like bishop e1 doesn't assist in that. So my opponent instead went ahead and captured on a6, which I expected, and after takes, here he played the move queen d3. I was very happy to see this move because I was expecting queen to a4, which I think would be a slightly better version of the same idea. I imagine that my opponent's idea was that if I played the move knight to c7, he was once again going to play the move c4, liquidate everything, and black has very, very few prospects of ever playing for a win. If he had played queen a4, I think that probably forces a little bit more. Now the only way to preserve this knight on a6 would be to play queen c8, but c4 here is still possible, and once again, everything is coming off. It's very, very difficult to imagine black having substantial advantages here. Also, queen c8 is also just a very, very weird looking move. So I wouldn't be surprised if white has some more ambitious options as well. Like, I don't know, maybe like knight f4 is very sensible, starting to reroute the knight to a very active position. Rook b1, just activating the rook. Like, it's not like white has to go for this sort of liquidation. But after queen d3, we have another option available to keep the character of the position, which is to move c4. It's a very committal decision because we have sort of fixed our own pawn structure. This will never be broken on either side, at least for a very, very long time. But it does prevent white from playing c4 himself, so we have at least kept many pieces on the board. The position is still very, very strategically complex. What the objective evaluation is matters a lot less because we have to win. Our opponent played queen c2, makes sense. I mean, just you have to put the queen somewhere. And now the game centers around a very obvious question that both players are going to be completely centering all of their plans around, which is whether white can ever achieve the move e3 to e4. This would both break down this very powerful pawn structure that we have, but it would also activate the dark square bishop, release sort of the tension that is keeping all of white's pieces at bay. And if white manages to play e4, especially after having played f3, so that white is able to take back with a pawn, if black does go ahead and capture, then white will have a completely massive center, just like most likely an overwhelming advantage under almost any circumstances. Very, very difficult to imagine a world where black allows e4, has to take, and is still not losing. So this defines the game, pretty much. If white can ever play e4, he's probably just winning. So what happens if white can't play e4? And this is an interesting question, honestly, that kind of turns back the clock for me a bit. You know, these are types of positions that I used to be very, very happy to get as a teenager with the black pieces when I was improving around like the 2200, 2300 level. Because my thought process was that I can prevent e4 forever. In this position, maybe not, maybe I can, I'm not 100% sure, but in this sort of type of position, I can prevent e4 forever. So white has no ideas, and I'll find a way to like win the game. And what I sort of gradually realized over the course of playing these types of positions over and over and over again over the years, and like to be clear, like this philosophy served me very well. I had many very nice games from positions like this where I prevent e4 forever, white has no ideas, and I find a way to win the game. But what I started to realize was that preventing e4 forever is not necessarily enough. It requires the attention of pretty much every piece in black's camp. You know, we probably end up have to like double the rooks. We have to put the queen on this file as well. Like we need all of our pieces dedicated to stopping the move e4. We probably need to reroute this knight to somewhere like d6. I mean, okay, obviously not for c5, but for like c7, b5 to d6. Like every piece needs to be focused on stopping e4. And the question is, okay, what do you have left to do ideas with? Like if every piece you have already has a job and they can't move, sure, maybe you stopped white's idea, so you're not going to be worse. Like white is not really going to have any active ideas, but you're not going to win. Like what is it that you're going to do? And this is one of the reasons that I have largely stopped playing the Nimzo. I mostly only play it against lower rated opposition now, because the opportunity for actually winning the game feels very, very slim. White only has one weakness in this sort of position, which is the inactive dark square bishop, and it's a temporary weakness. It's not something that's permanent, like a completely static advantage, like some other lines in the Nimzo where maybe like there's a weak c4 pawn, maybe there's a weak c3 pawn, maybe we can put like a knight on a5 and play bishop a6 and just try to collect this pawn. You know, in other games we call this a win condition. We don't really talk about it that way in chess, but the premise is still there. Like what would have to happen for you to actually win the game, and then you play towards that. It's really hard to come up with a win condition in a position like this for black that doesn't involve white either believing that you're going to stop e4 forever and going for a different plan which is somehow flawed, or a different plan that's slow enough that you get to do something with the pieces that are not tied down to e4, or just blundering something like around playing e4, like playing e4 at the wrong moment, or you know, playing something like g4 g5 to punch e4 through, which just introduces too many weaknesses. Like we're kind of back to a situation, even though it might not look like it, where white is the one that needs to do something wrong in order for us to actually win the game. So I wasn't thrilled to be here. I think 10 years ago I would have been very, very happy with this position, especially against a lower rated player. Nowadays, as an older, maybe wiser, maybe less wise player, I was very, very unhappy, or not very, very unhappy, like a little bit unhappy with the position that had transpired. But nevertheless, I mean, whether we're happy or not, the plan is very, very clear. Once again, we need to put all of our pieces we need to dedicate all of our pieces to preventing this idea with f3, e4, I mean knight g3. Like white is also going to be dedicating all of his resources to the same idea. So rook e8, f3, white is threatening to play knight g3, after which e4 will be unstoppable, so we need to preempt that with the move rook to e6. Now if white does play the move knight to g3, we're in time to stop it with queen e7, which is very, very important. Knight f5 is not dangerous, we just slide the queen over. The rook will be able to join to replace the queen's role. So my opponent instead played bishop to d2. At the time, I thought this was a bit of an odd move. It's not really clear why the bishop is going to d2. I was much more expecting, if anything, something like a4, followed by bishop a3, to try to get the bishop to do at least something. It's not a big role along this diagonal, but it does control the e7 square, which makes it difficult for black to triple up on the e-file at least. So I did think bishop d2 was a little bit strange. In hindsight, I think it was probably fine. I think I was over or underestimating it. During the game, it does have some useful roles on d2. For example, after rook e1, it's going to defend this rook, so there's not going to be too many problems with a pin along the e-file, which could be relevant later on. It does cement like the c3 pawn, which is hard to imagine being super relevant, but there are positions where the knight is planting on b5 on its way to d6, and if that were gaining a tempo by attacking the pawn, that would be helpful for black. So I think bishop d2 was just fine. And I played knight c7, which I think might have been a little bit sloppy. The idea was to, as we've talked about several times now, reroute the knight to d6, but I think that it might have been better to first play a move like queen d7, queen d6, for example, to get the other rook to the e-file first before going for this maneuver. Because what I realized after my opponent played rook e1, which is pretty obviously the idea behind bishop d2, is that white is about to add, like right now, if white played e4, there would be only two defenders, and we have three attackers. So we are very much overprotecting e4 right now. Like we are super fine. White should not be able to play e4. But if white does play knight g3, he's now adding both the knight and the rook as defenders. And so we, over the next two moves, even though we sort of have an extra move to prepare for knight g3, like white is going to make like a doubly effective move on the next move almost. So we need to dedicate both of our next two moves to adding defender or attackers to the e4 square, whatever you want to call it, controllers of the e4 square. And that's not really possible to do here, because if black plays queen e7, which would be the sensible reaction usually, after like knight g3, rook e8, we have enough firepower to prevent e4. There's a problem with the move knight to f4, because this rook on e6 now has no way back. It has to slide over. And once again, white is prepared to play e4, because instead of adding two defenders of the e4 square, white has only added one. but he's also forced away one of black's controllers of the e4 square, so it's still like a +2 sort of idea. So in this position, I spent quite a bit of time because I started to panic a little bit, honestly. Like, if we're not able to stop e4, we just lose. We've established this. And here it's not really possible to, because knight c7 was a little bit sloppy. What I was counting on was that after the move rook to e1, white is not defending the a3 pawn anymore, which in principle should be important. That should mean that we can gain a tempo by attacking the a4 pawn, the a3 pawn, and then introducing a defender. So my plan initially was to play knight b5, force the move a4, play knight d6, and now we've brought a defender of the e4 square, so if white continues with knight g3, now we can comfortably play queen e7. There is no knight f4 move, and we are very, very comfortable. The reason that I started to panic is because, well, you know, sure, we are attacking the a3 pawn. What if white doesn't care? You know, white can just continue with knight g3 anyway. This a3 pawn might not really be that important. And now if we go ahead and take, there's a number of problems, but the main one is after queen a4, the knight is kind of trapped. So we're forced to defend it with something like queen e7. Hope that, first of all, like rook a1 probably does just win the piece. But even if it didn't, after something like e4 takes, we're not able to take on e4 because the queen is needed to defend the knight. And white has made a very, very big center at the cost of like a very, very fake pawn on a3, which is just not really relevant to the game at all. White is pretty much just winning here, I think. So this idea doesn't work, which means we had to go for a similar, but probably also a bit of a bluff idea with queen d6. We are, in principle, attacking the a3 pawn, but I'm not sure it really matters. In fact, I'm gonna guess that it doesn't. After something like knight g3, queen takes a3, e4. Now, black won't take because, again, white gets a very, very big center. Black probably instead will play a move like queen f8, trying to get the queen back into the defense. But after something like e5, knight d7, f4, like it's very, very clear that white has a very, very strong attack coming, and black's extra pawn is very, very far from being relevant. It's going to take at least 3 or 4 moves before either the A or B pawns, like anything on the queen side, matters, and in the meantime we are facing a very, very strong attack. So I wasn't quite sure 100% how to evaluate this during the game. I mean, obviously we would have to go take the pawn. It's kind of the only idea. But I wouldn't be surprised if white is simply winning in this position. I think there's a decent chance that there's not really anything to discuss, honestly. Like, white is going to move all of his pieces forward on the king side, and like either he mates us or he doesn't. But I think more likely than not, he probably does mate us. So I spent a lot of time here. I played queen d6 anyway, because what else? And I was very relieved to see my opponent play the move bishop to c1. For a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, I was very, very scared that white would sacrifice the pawn. But also, I thought a4, worst case, would be a little bit more sensible than bishop c1, because this opens up a pathway for the bishop to move to the diagonal, and more importantly, it controls the b5 square, so the knight has no route back to d6. There is another line that I thought was a little bit interesting. I'm not sure if it was super relevant, but white also has the option of playing knight f4 here, which puts a very, very unpleasant question to this rook of where to move back. We would like to move back to e7, but now after e4, queen takes a3, e5, knight d7, this queen is very, very, very short of squares. And so after rook a1, we no longer have a route back because the rook on e7 has cut off this diagonal, which means we have to go to b3. And now, first of all, if white is not really playing ambitiously, takes, and rook b1 is probably going to be more than enough to... I mean, probably white is even still pressing in this endgame, honestly, but white is definitely not in any danger, I'm pretty sure. But more likely, white would not do that and instead play something like queen f5 when it's very, very difficult to find a route back for the queen. We pretty much have to play queen b5 here, which is forced, and then white has a number of ideas on the king side to keep up the pressure. So I was a little concerned about this as well. Eventually I decided I think we're okay getting the queen back to c6. I think it gets back just in time to defend everything, but it is also probably something that my opponent was considering. And then again, after like knight f4 or rook e7, like if we go down this line, another option for white is just to play a move like knight h5, intending f4, f5, which also looks like a very, very scary way to continue the attack, because again, the queen has a very, very hard time coming back into the game. So if we instead play rook e8, now, you know, it's very, very difficult to get the other rook into the game because we've had to occupy the e file, unfortunately, with this rook. And so now after e4 takes, you know, same thing, like maybe knight h5. Okay, at least the queen is coming back into the game, sort of. But we're playing basically without a couple of our pieces. And again, this pawn is very, very far from doing anything useful. f4, f5, f6 is the very, very simple plan. I think this is also a very, very powerful way to generate an attack. So both knight g3 or knight f4, I think were very, very scary for me. Very, very happy to see the move bishop to c1. After that, we were able to play rook e8, and now we are at least stopping e4 for the time being. Knight g3, queen c6, both sides again continuing to pile up. Rook e2, intending rook e1, bringing in another defender of e4. And now, you know, black has kind of run out of juice of how to prevent e4. We could bring the knight in, which we'll see is shortly is a thing that we do end up doing. But I decided first to try, you know, there's sort of two ways to deal with e4. We can either bring more of our own forces or we can push away the opponents. And so I thought that it was probably better here to go for the latter. Started with g6, I'm not sure if it really matters. Rook e1, h5. We could have played h5 or g6 in the other order. But the idea is pretty transparent. We just want to play h4, kick away white's knight when it will have a hard time rejoining the support of e4. And very importantly, white can't play e4 immediately because after h4, we are kicking away a defender. Maybe technically this is even playable, but even worst case, if we had to play like queen takes, something like this is a big accomplishment for black. This bishop is still very, very weak. We haven't given away the full center, and I think this position black has probably not an objective advantage, but definitely something to play for. Plus, more likely, we can just play, you know, rook takes e2 or something. So my opponent, I was expecting to move h4 now. I thought it was white's only reasonable move, just to prevent h4 from black. The downside of this is that the knight on g3 has lost its pawn support, and so we can play a move like queen to d6. The problem that we sort of have here is that if white simply moves the knight, we've now moved, we have harassed away the g3 knight, but we've used our queen to do it. And so e4 is still a threat from white, and probably black has nothing better than just to go back to c6, or maybe to e7, probably doesn't make much of a difference. White can go back to g3, threaten e4, and once again, there's no real way to stop that other than harassing the knight with queen back to d6. And, you know, we make a repetition and draw. So I was definitely expecting h4 for that reason. If white plays h4, I think black objectively has to take the repetition. There's probably no other real idea. I was going to find something. I mean, again, we have to win. So I would have tried something, but I don't really know what, to be honest. And while I was considering this, my opponent played a different move, which I hadn't seen at all, which was this very odd-looking move, knight to h1, but a very, very powerful one. White is saying, okay, sure, my knight on g3, that was supporting e4, it's about to be harassed by h4. Let's instead move it to a square where it still supports e4, but is not going to be harassed by the h4 pawn. At this point, I really started to feel pretty uncomfortable, because I realized at this point that e4 is going to be unstoppable, which I knew for a while. I mean, I was trying to interfere with it as long as possible, but I knew sooner or later e4 was going to get punched through. But this is kind of the moment that we've arrived at. Like, e4 is coming, like, very quickly, probably in the next two moves. We need to prepare ourselves somehow. There are basically two ways to do it. We can either try to generate our own counterplay, this is generally how these lines resolve, by the way. White organizes all his forces to preparing e4, black organizes all his forces to defending e4, white eventually punches it through, but because of all the contortions that he's had to go to actually get e4 in, black either has enough time to generate counterplay of his own, or the punch of e4 has been kind of stymied. It requires too many exchanges, or black's managed to get all his pieces out of the way of the center, whatever. Generally leads to some sort of equality. So one way to do this is to play b5, intending to meet knight f2 with just a5, and going for b4 ideas, trying to break down the white center as sort of as well as our own. If white's going to destroy ours, we're going to at least get something back for it. But I didn't really see after e4. I mean, we can play b4, I guess, but it's not really clear that we've accomplished anything by doing this. Yes, we've annoyed white for sure. This d4 pawn has become weak. This b4 pawn is an extra pawn, but it's also weak. We can play knight b5, which is a very, very pleasant square for the knight. But I thought realistically the best case scenario here is we trade off all of these pawns, winning a pawn in the process. We take all three of white's pawns, white takes all three of ours, and then just a draw. Which is not a bad outcome in a normal game, but here we have to win. So I didn't consider it very deeply. There's a strong possibility that it was more to it here. Maybe black is actually doing quite well in this position. I didn't really think about it all that much, because my impression was that my best case scenario here is equality. Maybe my worst case scenario here is also equality. But if we want to keep the game going, I spotted a different idea, which I don't know how to evaluate. It felt very superficial in the moment, but maybe it's fine. My opponent here was also in a little bit of time pressure, so I wanted to keep things as complicated as possible. It begins with the move knight to b5. We finally execute this maneuver that we've been talking about all game to get the knight to d6. You might be wondering by now why we didn't do this earlier, since we've been talking about it so much. And it's because white is prepared to meet it with the move a4, intending bishop a3, and then removing this knight that has taken such a circuitous journey to the d6 square. White basically would have responded to knight b5 d6 with this a4 bishop a3 idea at pretty much any point, and so there's kind of this mutual standoff where neither side really sees a point. White also could have played a4 bishop a3 at any moment, but there was no reason to because there's nothing on d6. And black could have played knight b5 to d6 at any moment, but there was no reason to because white could always play a4 bishop a3. But now the standoff concludes, and with bishop a3 coming, my big idea was to play h4. And now after bishop a3, we play the move knight to h5. This is the point of h4 to vacate the square for the knight. The whole idea here now is that if white ever plays e4, we will at least have the f4 square available for our knight. This is why we played knight b5 d6. It was to divert the bishop away from the defensive f4. And now, so we sort of swap basically. Up until this point, we've been playing very directly, preventing e4. Now we're swapping to a very indirect style. We're saying, okay, you got me, you're going to play e4, I'm going to work around it. It's a big board. Sure, you might get a couple squares in the center, but I'm going to use the other 62 squares. Congratulations, make something of your center or don't. But this is very superficial in the sense that if white doesn't play e4, it's not really clear what the whole point of this whole operation was, right? And we have vacated the direct defense of e4, which means that white has various ways to sort of continue the game. The one that I was most concerned about and expecting was knight h3, just controlling the f4 square indirectly, and also rerouting the knight once again. We've already seen the knight on g3 reroute once to support e4 from a different square. This would reroute the knight once again to support the knight, the e4 push from g5. So, once again, white is threatening e4. Both sides have moved a defender away. And if we go back, first of all, white can repeat. But second of all, after knight g5, rook e7, e4, white is probably just winning. Seems very, very, very bad for black. So I was most concerned about knight h3. Wasn't really sure what I was going to play here. Probably, I don't know, knight f5, something. Just hope. Honestly, there wasn't really a lot of thought that went into this. This was just a way to keep the game going. But I was very fortunate that my opponent blundered very quickly with the move e4, which again is the whole purpose of my play with h4 knight h5 is to indirectly prevent this move. So we better hope that we're preventing it. And fortunately we are. After knight to f4, we're attacking the rook. It only has 2 squares. If white slides away to d2, this has abandoned the defense of e4. So we take on e4. If white takes back, then we're just up a pawn for, no compensation. Well, I guess a little bit of compensation technically, but no real compensation. So white is forced to take on d6. And here I thought that there's probably a few ways to continue, but the one that looked most interesting to me was to move e3. Now, if white goes ahead and takes the knight, we take the knight with check, which exposes sort of a discovered attack of our own. We're going to pick up a rook and win material. Still wasn't sure it's winning, to be honest, because after the bishop comes to e5, it still looks a little unpleasant. I think it's fine because f6 is coming eventually, but not like 100% clear. And if white instead plays something like, I don't know, rook takes e3, like again, we're taking back, and very importantly, we're threatening rook e1 mate, so white doesn't have time to collect the second piece for the rook. So rook to d2, in theory not possible, which makes the obvious question, okay, what's wrong with rook e3? This was part of the point of e4 was to give the rook a second square along the e-file. And this is what I assume my opponent overlooked when going for this idea. We have a very, very nice tactical shot. This is, you can probably you can probably find it if you don't see it yet. This is a good exercise to pause and look for yourself. But here, black has a very, very nice move, which I found pretty quickly. Knight to f5. This is the move that I foresaw from h4, and this is the thing that convinced me to go for this whole knight b5, knight d6, h4, knight h5 idea instead of b5, a5, which was maybe objectively better. Now white probably has no options. The rook is just trapped. We're exploiting this pin along the e-file, so white cannot take. We will win in exchange at a much better version because we'll also get the e-file along the way, which means that white's king is very, very unsafe. Once again, we're going to be threatening mate on e2. So my opponent, at this point realized, okay, he's going to lose an exchange. What's the best way to lose it? And played what I think was a very good practical move, e5. And here I needed to think a little bit because I stopped my calculation at knight f5, which, one does, because, we're up in exchange, like, it's not clear how easy a conversion it's going to be, but it's good enough to stop like the previous calculation. But once we're here, now we do need to figure out how to convert the material. If we go ahead and directly take it with something like takes, white is going to play g3 and f4 next. We do have an extra rook, but there are no open files in the position, so it's not immediately clear that like this rook on e6 is even any better than this bishop, let alone this knight that's going to join the game through g4, maybe to f6. In principle, white is kind of close to generating some pretty serious counterplay. So we need to open files immediately. Ideally the e-file, because that's where our rooks are, but at least some file. And so after some time, I came up with what I think was a pretty good solution. I'm not sure if it was the best, but it made sense to me, which was to start with this move b5, trying to open up some files on the queen side. So now if white goes ahead and takes, importantly, this rook is still trapped, so we can go ahead and take this rook whenever. There's no immediate need to. And now with both the A and B files usable for the rooks, it feels like a much more serious material advantage than when everything was closed up. So as I expected, my opponent played a5, trying to keep some of the files closed. And this is where I found, or sort of demonstrated, the second point of the idea of b5, which is that we get now some time to reroute this queen that wasn't really doing anything on c6 anymore, just kind of staring into the void. We play queen to c7. This pretty much forces bishop to b4. In a sense, I mean, it doesn't really force it. There are other options, but it's the most sensible thing to, again, just try to keep everything closed up. And only now we go ahead and take the rook and play this very nice move, queen to d8, intending to transition the queen over to the king side, where, first of all, it takes up a much more active position. You know, again, on c6 it wasn't really doing anything. On g5 it has much more of a both aggressive and defensive role. And also, very concretely, we are threatening checkmate once the queen comes to g5, which is surprisingly difficult for white to defend against. My opponent played knight to g4, which makes sense, and this was a line that I had foreseen when I played b5. Now, the line that I wanted to play was f5. This was the original point, because now white cannot take en passant, even though en passant usually is a forced move, because we're just taking material along the e-file, and very importantly, our knight is defending the g6 pawn, so we're able to get away with this without white generating any real attack. So the knight, in theory, is forced to move back, and then after queen to g5, again, white can't actually defend against this mate threat very comfortably because we're also threatening knight to h3 with a discovered attack against the rook. This basically means like knight d1 is forced to try to defend from the side while also defending the rook. But among other things, this allows the knight to come to d3, which would be positionally winning. There's probably other ways to continue the attack as well. Something like h3, trying to compromise the structure, maybe now knight d3 with f4 coming. I mean, it was winning the whole time, I guess, after we took the exchange, so it's not like it's winning now sort of moment, but it definitely is a much clearer consolidation from here. But the issue that I had with f5 once we reached this position is that I actually started to get a little bit scared of what happens if white sacrifices even more material. First of all, we can't go to h7 because after knight f7, there's actually no way for the queen to maintain contact with g5. So after like queen d7, white regains the exchange and should have no problems. So we have to go king g7 to keep the f7 square protected. Now white can sacrifice the piece for just 2 pawns, you know, nothing else. So now white is down a full rook for 2 pawns. But it's not really clear what black does to untangle. You know, suddenly this bishop looks very, very annoying. It controls both the e7 and f8 squares. This knight is under attack, where it was very powerful, but now it's being harassed. And if we slide back with knight g6, which looks very normal, then after a very, very simple, just caveman idea of playing f4, queen g4, f5, not really obvious how black deals with this, to be honest. So I was very close to just playing this and just like trusting that, okay, I mean, I'm up a rook, like surely there's a way. But even in hindsight, I'm not 100% sure that black is even winning this. There's a decent chance that objectively it might actually be kind of close to fine for white. In fact, I might actually have trouble playing this with black, to be honest. I might prefer to be white. So I definitely didn't want to allow this kind of counterplay. You know, if it was a different situation where, you know, we weren't already winning and this was the way to like generate winning chances, then we would have to suck it up and just allow it. But fortunately here we have many ways to continue the game. And the simplest by far is just to start with queen to g5. Invert the order. Now we're again threatening f5, so white needs to do something immediate, and by you know, controlling all of the squares around our king, we make sure that there's no counterplay to speak of. No accidents about to happen. So my opponent, you know, saw f5 coming, decided he had to give away a second exchange, but this is just too much. We have f6, which is blasting open the e-file. The nice thing about being up 2 exchanges rather than 1 is you can give one of the exchanges back and you'll still be up a lot of material, which is pretty much what happened after, you know, takes. We sacrifice the exchange, and here my opponent very reasonably resigned. In fact, because g3 was played, we can even insert this intermediate move to pick up one more pawn along the way to a very, very winning endgame with an exchange in 2 pawns if we want. Or we can not. I mean, we can also just take on e5, whatever. Doesn't really matter. Everything's winning at this point. So it wasn't pretty, for sure. There were definitely many points along the way where I felt I might not even be better. Like, I might even be much, much worse. Especially somewhere around when we were sort of bluffing a little bit by attacking a3. Let's see. We had not entirely a bluff. Seems like black is hanging in there. But white very much should sacrifice this pawn on a3. This was all, yeah, this was something I didn't mention, but I did consider during the game as well. White can actually start with e4. It doesn't need to necessarily prepare it with knight g3 or knight f4, because if we do take, then after bishop f4, white is forcing the queen all the way back, and there's just too much pressure in the center for this to be allowed. Also, knight f4. Well, I guess knight f4 there's e3. I didn't really see that during the game, but if we had to slide back, then this is another way to support e4. So white can even start with e4 and reach pretty much the same position we've been talking about early in the video. I guess either knight e8 or knight d7, and okay, maybe there is a big difference. We do have to go to e8. I didn't really consider knight e8 during the game all that carefully, but it makes a little bit of sense, I guess. Like, we want to be able to defend the f5 square sometimes. Not 100% sure, but okay. I mean, it seems like my assessment was reasonable. Very, very dangerous for black, but maybe survivable. And yeah, we should just not allow this. Well, actually, it's kind of okay with knight e7. Here it actually likes queen e7. So queen e7 is a very reasonable move. We're attacking a3. We're also defending e4, but I thought knight f4 here just punches e4 through immediately. e4, okay, now it does, okay, so a very, very similar position, but I guess a slightly better version because the rook is preserved as a defender. Any case, I mean, okay, we got it done. Not pretty, not the way that I necessarily wanted to win a game, but it is a win, very important. We keep the tournament alive, at least. It's going to be very important that we string together a few wins. Like, we can't stop here. This has to be the start of a at least probably 3-game win streak in order to get this tournament even like survivable, back into positive territory. So thank you guys for watching. This is a interesting game, turning back the clock to some very, very old games that I had as a teenager. Hopefully the results will continue to follow, and I will see you all back for round 3, where we will have the white pieces, probably, and damn well better get a second win in a row. See you all next time.